Welcome to the Rockabye Revenue podcast with me, Abby Watson. I'm a mum of 4 and a business strategist, and I train people to become hypnobirthing teachers. In the last decade, I've built a thriving baby business that grew beyond my wildest dreams. This podcast is for you if you run a business or dream of running a business in the birth and baby industry. You want to change lives whilst making more money. I'm talking about creating sustainable income whilst being present for the people that matter most. I believe for our baby businesses to have the impact we desire, we must be rewarded. On this podcast, expect me to share actionable strategies without the jargon. I've been where you are. I've built a business while raising 4 little ones, and now I'm here to help you turn your passion into profit while creating the life you've always dreamed of. So let's get started. Hello, lovely one. Welcome back to another episode of Rockabye Revenue. A very special episode, actually. This week marks exactly a year from the launch of this podcast. We have had over 50 episodes of this podcast, and every single week, without fail, I've released a new episode. So I thought it would be good to come on today and share my biggest lessons from launching this podcast and having this very loved by myself, I don't know about anybody else, podcast. Now, if you have been one of the people here from the very start, oh my gosh, I absolutely thank you for, your time. Like, listening to this podcast, having it in your earbuds or in the car on the way to the school run or whatever, like, it is such an honour that, you have chosen to listen to this podcast. And I really, really hope that it has been a motivator, a source of advice, a source of comfort, a source of not being alone in this. I really hope it's provided all those things, because that was absolutely my intention and continues to be my intention in recording these episodes. So November 2024 was when I launched this podcast. And I've got to say, it was a long time in the making. Now, not physically, but what I mean is I'd planned to launch this podcast for a very long time. And I guess I put it off for too long, because of the logistics, literally not knowing how to go about it, not knowing the tech side of it. So I'd put it off for a long time, and I finally announced in the September of that year that it was coming, and I spent the next 2 months recording episodes, drumming up excitement for this podcast, and now it forms a regular part of my work, as in I always ensure that every single week there is an episode lined up. And even during really hard times in my year, and there's been plenty, I've committed to making sure an episode goes out. And I guess this has been my first lesson of this podcast, that I absolutely thrive on that consistency. I need that. I need that kind of almost invisible accountability to get on and do the thing. So knowing that every Tuesday a new episode goes out meant that I had to do it, and don't get me wrong, as much as when I get on the mic and I get going, I love it. I do experience, certainly some weeks, some real resistance and some feelings of, I don't even know if I've got anything to say. What do I talk about? And sometimes in some of my hardest weeks in my personal life, I've definitely had feelings of like, well, this all seems like, it just seems insignificant compared to all the things that I've got going on in my life. So how can I come on and talk about tips for bookings, when someone really close to us in our lives, in our families passed away? How can I talk about, boosting your business when sometimes I feel like, why am I even running a business? Like, my personal life is so crazy, and my biggest fight is getting my son into school. But actually, it has been such a gift that has kept me always feeling like I was making steps and supporting my community even during those hard times. So biggest lesson has been, I need that consistency. I need that kind of accountability to get that content out there. And when I say consistency, I really don't mean constantly. There's a real difference. So as much as an episode is released every single Tuesday, it doesn't mean that the night before I'm recording an episode. Sometimes, yeah, but quite often it's me thinking, next week I'm really not going to have time to record an episode, or I know I'm not going to be in the right headspace to record an episode. So let me do myself a favour and batch a few and have them lined up to go out. So consistency doesn't have to mean constantly. And this podcast has been a real lesson in that, that being visible doesn't mean that I have to be feeling it every single time. Actually, I can go ahead and bulk a chunk of stuff that can go out and it still has the same impact as in comparison to me doing it live in the moment. Now, some of you might know that before I created this podcast, my regular visibility was actually doing lives in a Facebook group, and I had been so attached to doing that. Like, I'd done it for years. Like, I had this lovely community of hypnobirthing teachers and aspiring hypnobirthing teachers, and every week I went in there and I did a live video on the kind of similar topics that I talk about on this podcast. And I was so attached to that, and I felt like that's what's worked for my business. That's what's built community in my business. That's what's helped people get to know me. And then as a result, come and join my training school. It had been a big part of my success. So I was so reliant on that, and this feeling that that's what I had to do to be visible. And this podcast has been a great lesson in that as well, in that we don't have to do the same thing that has worked for us previously. My life looks really different to what my life looked like 3 years ago. And it's okay if my business evolves with that, and the way that I'm visible in my business changes to match what's going on in my personal life. That's okay. And I tell you what, lesson learned, what worked for me 1 year, something else can work for me another year. And like I say, this podcast has absolutely demonstrated that to me. So if you are listening to this and you are thinking, okay, I need to be more visible in my business, I need to build connection with potential buyers of my service, there's a blooming million, well, maybe not a million, but there's lots and lots of different ways that you can do that. You can have a podcast. You can show up on Instagram stories. You can have a YouTube channel. You can have an incredible website with a great blog. There's so many different ways of doing that. And it's okay to choose one that suits the season of your business and of your life better at the time. That's totally okay. The key thing is committing to the consistency of that. And like I say, consistency doesn't have to mean that you are doing it every single week day without fail live. You know, you can batch, you can bulk content exactly as I have done with this podcast, so that you have got that ability to be constantly visible even when you are not constantly online. Do you want to be constantly online? If the answer is no, there are many, many ways that you can appear constantly visible without actually being there live. And definitely launching this podcast has proven that to me, and I really hope it's also proven that to you too. Second lesson of this very much loved by myself podcast is that it's not the episodes where I've sat down and thought, right, put all my top tips into this, you know, share every ounce of my knowledge on this topic, that are going to be the popular ones. The most popular episodes, the most listened to episodes, the most, you know, kind of talked about episodes, the episodes that get the most interaction in my inbox are not the ones that are full of tips and strategies. Guess what they are? They're the most personal ones, the most vulnerable ones, the ones that I nearly didn't post. So the lesson here for myself and for you too listening is that people do want real. People don't always want loads of tips. Actually feeling connection to someone through hearing their personal tales. Sometimes they're very difficult tales, means more than loads of tips. We are in an age where people can get information everywhere, you know? We want a strategy for our social media. We can go to ChatGPT, put in the type of business and tell it to give us, you know, a social media strategy. We can get that so easily, but actually connecting with somebody a few steps ahead of you, hearing about challenges in their life and how they've overcome them, we can't get as easily. So I want you to hear this and remember that the things that you might know you could talk about in your own marketing, but you're like, oh, but is it relevant? Is it relevant? Actually, are going to people think I'm like trauma dumping on them? It actually might be the content that gets people connecting with you. Can you hear my tummy? My tummy is going crazy rumbling. But yeah, like those personal stories, you sharing an element of vulnerability, that's where the connection will happen. And when I look at the stats of my podcast, like literally taking it to the data, that is so evident. You know, episodes such as episode number 3, where I talked about my biggest challenges in my life and what I learned from them, one of the most popular and listened to podcasts. The one where I talked about, you know, the lessons from the one where I talked about what they don't talk about at funerals, where I reflected upon, you know, the loss of my brother-in-law recently and how it made me think about purpose and what I want out of my business. Again, most listened to. The ones where I talk about, you know, what I've not got all together and the strains that, you know, motherhood. I nearly said brotherhood, not brotherhood. I've not experienced that. Motherhood and its challenges when running a business. Again, the most listened to, the most inbox messages from, because it's that people connect with. Now, of course, I wouldn't create a podcast that was solely that. You know, we have got to share our expertise. I'm not sure if I was just like, you know, Rockabye Revenue, a podcast that shares all my struggles and difficult moments in life. Come and listen. I'm sure people wouldn't subscribe. You know, we have to be sharing some quality tips, strategies as well. But we mustn't miss out the personal stuff, because it's the personal stuff that creates that connection, that relatability, forms those relationships. And that has been such a lesson in this last year. Another lesson from building this podcast is that, yeah, I really do find it weird not seeing responses from people, you know. So like I said, every week an episode of this podcast goes out, and I can look in my statistics to see, you know, and I'm terrible at looking at my statistics, by the way, but if I want to, I could go look and see, you know, how many people listened, how many people listened to the full thing, etc., etc. But it is weird. It is weird, you know, ultimately sat in my living room talking to a mic, you know, imagining talking to you, but you not actually being there. And then, of course, not seeing the light bulb moments, not getting that kind of affirmation that, you know, this is landing. It's difficult. And, you know, the teacher in me, you know, as a teacher, like, that's what we get. And then we tailor how we're saying things to the responses. And of course, doing a podcast, I'm not getting that. And yeah, some of you absolutely do reach out to me and share like your takeaways and what you thought. And I love that. You know, I really do love that. But I'm still not getting it in real time. And that is weird. And it can sometimes be uncomfortable, and it can lead to self-doubt. Absolutely. It can lead to overthinking. So, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat the success of this podcast in saying it's always felt great. It hasn't. And there's definitely been times where I thought, you know, do people actually like it? Is it a good use of my time? And I'm not saying, you know, forevermore it will be my strategy in my business. It might not be. But yeah, there's definitely been times of overthinking it. Okay. However, the lesson that has come alongside that is the kind of like in the moment validation from people. That's going to come with live video, isn't it? You know, and that's what I used to do. And maybe I needed that validation that what I was saying was making sense. Maybe I did. But that comes with real downsides too. I had to show up when I said I was going to show up, no matter what happened in my day. And like I said earlier in this episode, right now in my life, that's more challenging, you know? Those of you that listen to this podcast regularly will know, you know, my eldest son is at home. He has additional needs. He wasn't coping in his secondary school. We are fighting for him a specialist placement. And as a result, you know, I'm caring for him, taking him to stuff, trying to keep his mental well-being in a great place on my own, you know. So, like, having to show up live is not always possible. So the downside of not getting that validation, well, the plus side is that I get to show up still. And that is so more important, you know? So as much as the perfectionist in me might be like, oh, but, you know, if I'm going to do it right, I'm going to interact with people during, and that can only come from live. Well, that's not possible right now, and that's okay, you know? That's not possible, and that's okay. So the lesson has been that we get to work in seasons, and we get to deliver our marketing in a way that fits our life, you know? And yes, sometimes that might come with imperfections and downsides even, but if actually we get to continue our business, that's the priority, yeah? And get to live the life that we need to live at that time. And my other lesson, and I talked about numbers a minute ago, like when you host a podcast, a bit like so many different methods of marketing, there's data, you know? So if you have a blog, for example, you can look at the data behind that blog, can't you? How many people have read your blog? How long people stayed on the page? So on and so on. Same with podcasts. So of course we can look at the data. And, you know, before I started my podcast, I think I was a little bit naive into the numbers that come with a successful podcast, you know, and I was kind of thinking that a podcast that's worthwhile doing, there'd be like thousands of people listening in every month. That is really not the case, you know. Some months, you know, there's a couple of hundred people listening in. And again, that's okay. The numbers don't matter as much as what's coming out at the other end. So I could have a podcast that had thousands of listeners, but if actually it wasn't doing good stuff for my business, it's pretty pointless, isn't it? So as much as we can like feel like, oh my gosh, the numbers matter so much, if actually I'm getting people sign up to my training that are saying, oh, I stumbled upon you from your podcast and I knew I had to do your training because I felt so connected to you and I loved your story and your tips. That's what matters. That's what matters more than the numbers. And I want that to be your reminder too. We can overanalyze the numbers, whether it's on social media, whether it's on our website, and we can be like, oh my gosh, why am I even bothering if only this many people sees my Instagram story? If I only get 2 likes on my Instagram post, and one's from my Auntie Sue and one's from my ex-colleague. You know, the likes, the figures mean very little as long as we're getting out of it what we wanted, you know. And I used to say this to people when I ran a course called Be Seen, Be Booked, which was all about being visible in your baby business. And I used to talk about the fact that we can almost get motivated by the numbers, and it can be detrimental to us. So we can see that actually we get more likes when we talk about a certain thing. So we keep talking about that certain thing. But then actually we realize that those likes are coming from other business owners that we are not selling to. And then when we post a post that, you know, gets 0 likes, but actually lands you a booking, we do less of them. Because again, we're just kind of like doing it for the hit of the numbers when actually that's not what matters when it comes to business. And actually, you know, if we are truly talking to the potential clients that we want to talk to, the numbers might be a lot less than if we spoke more generally. But actually, if we're talking to those people that really need our services and they're so connected, that's going to have the biggest outcome for our business. Those people are going to turn into bookings rather than if we're just talking really generally. And this has absolutely been a reminder of that, you know? The numbers matter less than the impact. The numbers matter less than what we're getting out of something from a business perspective. So please, please remember that. And also remember that when we're looking at other people. Isn't it easy to look at other business owners and be like, whoa, look how many followers she's got. Look how many subscribers she's got. she must be doing really, really well. How do we know? How do we know? If your intention in your business is to get full group courses, to be earning a certain amount, but we're looking at that person that's got tons of followers and we're thinking, I need to be more like them. Well, that's a load of nonsense if we don't actually know what they're getting out of their strategy. Yes, they might have loads of subscribers. Yes, they might get loads of likes on their post, but have they got the revenue coming through? Are they getting the bookings, or are we assuming they are? So as much as numbers matter, let's not make assumptions based on the numbers. And let's only focus, or maybe not only focus, but let's make a priority to consider the impact of actually the bookings rather than just general reach. I hope that makes sense anyway. And my final lesson from a year of Rockabye Revenue is that the thing that feels brave and scary and hard will be the thing that one day you look back and you're like, I'm glad I did that hard thing. Because now it's the easy thing, you know? And now it's so established, I don't even have to think about the logistics. So if I go back a year ago when I was launching this podcast, oh my gosh, it was hardcore. You know, I had to be banging the drum for it all the time. I had to be recording episodes so frequently, because the thing about launching a successful podcast is that really you need a bunch of episodes going out in that first month. So I didn't start with one episode a week. You know, when I first launched my podcast, there was 4 going out in that first week. And then that was followed by 2 every week after. Okay, it was hard going. And of course, because I wasn't used to recording podcasts, I was also getting my head around technology, you know, getting my head around like, what am I actually going to talk about? It did feel really hard and really exhausting. And there were times when I was thinking, have I done the right thing? You know, move into this direction, because if it feels this hard, I don't want my weeks to feel this hard going forward. So it felt hard. It felt out of my comfort zone. I felt like very vulnerable, like putting myself out there, you know, putting my big girl pants on, making a big deal out of this, and then thinking, who am I to be doing this podcast? It felt hard and it felt scary. A year on, with over 50 episodes out there, with, you know, loads of great feedback, I'm like, thank goodness I pushed through that hard month, that hard couple of months. Thank goodness I got my head around this whole new way of marketing my business. Thank goodness. And I am so grateful to the brave version of me who did it. So again, if you are listening to this and maybe there's something that you want to do in your business, but it feels scary, and maybe you're not exactly sure how to go about it. Maybe you don't even know where to start. And you're like, oh, should I bother? Should I bother? Well, just remember there will be a version of you, a year older, a few more grey hairs, that looks back and says, good on you, missus. Well done for taking the plunge and pushing through that hardness, because now it's easy. Now it's easy and it's just part of your routine and you don't even have to think much about it. Yeah, your future self will be grateful, just as I am for the 39-year-old Abby that got going with this podcast. I've been doing it a year. I've now gone into my 40s. There's been a lot of chaos happening in my life, but I'm blimmin' glad I stuck to it and did it. and you will too, whatever your big thing is. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. If you are one of the absolute lovelies that have been a loyal listener to this podcast, please let me know. I'd love to give you a hug and thank you so much. And if you've been one of the absolute legends that has sent other listeners my way, you've shared it with a friend, you've told someone in this industry about this podcast, I love you. I really, really do. And if you haven't yet, do me a favour on the anniversary of this podcast, help me get it in front of more ears by sending it to your pals, by sharing it in groups that maybe you're in, telling people what you've got out of this podcast and how they might benefit too. I really think there is a lack of great support and guidance for birth and baby business owners, and I really hope that this podcast fills a bit of that hole. So yeah, do me a favour by sharing it to get the word out about this podcast. I would love you forever if you do so. Right, that's it for this week. I hope you have a beautiful week, and as always, keep on changing lives. Take care. Bye. Thank you for listening to Rockabye Revenue. I hope this episode has left you with some fresh ideas and bundles of motivation. If you enjoyed this episode, do make sure you click subscribe so you never miss an installment. And if you found this episode useful, I'd love you forever if you leave a 5-star review, helping this podcast reach the ears of more of the helpers in this world. And remember, keep changing lives. See you next time.